is God's word. I am going to read his story. When you begin with God, you will quickly see, number one, that God has always been there. That's what verse 1 is all about in this great passage that I read. It's very quite simple. God said it in the beginning, God. And when you begin with God, you will very quickly discover that God has always been there. You see, what God is saying to us at the beginning of his story is that he is, in fact, exactly who he says he is. And he's the only one. He's the only God. There are no other gods. And he is eternal. He's sovereign. He's eternally existent. He's majestic in all his ways. And it's no wonder that when one gets to the end of the story, and I wrote in my note to you that next week, on the 27th at 5 o'clock in the dining hall, some of you may want to come. Because as we begin our Bible study for the fall semester, I'm going to, in 40 minutes, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do the impossible, and I'm going to teach the entire book of Revelation in 40 minutes. I'm going to help you to cheat in this Bible study, just like you do when you read that novel. And just by accident, you just happen to see that, in fact, they did get married at the end of the novel, and so it takes all the pressure off you. And some of you have always been wondering, how does it, if it begins like this, how does it end? God tells us how it ends, because he is the in the beginning God. So I can tell you unequivocally that the story is going to affirm that very quickly you will see that God has always been there, which means because of his eternal, sovereign, divine nature, he always will be there. He hasn't gone anywhere. Number two, you will very quickly see that people have always been too. When you begin with God, you very quickly discover, that's what we read about in verse 27, God created man in his own image. He created them both, what was it that he said? Male and female. Just as a matter of interest, how many of you are male? Would you please raise your hand? Hold it up, brother. Don't be shy. Be a real man. All the men in here stand. Thank you. Please be seated. Ladies, would you please stand? If you're a lady, would you stand, please? Thank you so much. Please be seated. Let me tell you about what happens when you read the story and you lay aside all the things that you wonder about and you think about and you query about and you try to figure out, and you will very quickly discover that people have always been just two. God didn't make man any other way. Male and female. But you're also going to discover something very quickly when you begin with God. Number three, you will discover that sin has always been a killer. Let me just run that by again. Sin has always been a killer. See, that's what we are reading about here in chapter 6. I just read to you one little excerpt, how that God came to the determination that the heart of man is exceedingly wicked, and God grieved in his heart that he had made a people like you and me. And so he made an eternal divine decision that he could not in any way tolerate the sin of man. There was no room in his righteous heart. He could not accommodate sin because he is holy. This is the God in the beginning of which we speak. This is his story. And so God was trying to show us that sin has always been a killer. In fact, it began with Adam and Eve. They were perfect. They had a beautiful place to live, and they sinned against God, and that relationship was summarily terminated. They were thrown out. That's what happens to you and me when we sin. Sin is a killer. It's never changed. God didn't put a rider onto this. It wasn't even a theorem. Pythagoras wouldn't even be able to wendle his way through something like this. There was no kind of formula that could be applied to circumvent what God was telling us about everything that contradicts the holiness and the righteousness of God. Sin is a killer. It destroys, it separates. It moves you from the front row to the back row. It means that you cannot have fellowship with God. Sin has always been a killer.